This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 31 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, July 30th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Miss Mary Davis and her niece, Miss Edith of Providence, Rhode Island, have been guests of Miss Ruth Fisher this week. Miss Sarah E. Wood of Marlborough, New Hampshire, has been a guest for several days this past week at the Congregational Parsonage. Mr. and Mrs. Henry M. Wright and Livingston and Mr. and Mrs. H.V. Hildreth and Leon spent Saturday and Sunday together at camp at Forge Pond. Charles D. Howard, son of Mr. and Mrs. Calvin Howard and state chemist of Concord, New Hampshire, was one of the speakers at the annual State Convention of Druggists at Hooksett last week. At a special meeting of the Tadmuck Club, called at Library Hall Tuesday afternoon, Mrs. Leonard W. Wheeler was elected secretary and treasurer in place of Mrs. W. A. Woodward, whose removal from town necessitates her resignation. The members also voted to send Mr. and Mrs. Herbert E. Fletcher a letter of sympathy in their bereavement in the death of their son. Louis Lorenzo Fletcher, who was born September 21st, 1898, died July 23rd, 1910. Mrs. Fletcher has been a helpful and interested member of the club since its organization. Mrs. Fred A. Hildreth, Mrs. Kate Allen, and daughter Catherine are guests at H.V. Hildreth's. Parents having children who are entering school at the fall term are reminded that their vaccination should be attended to this month. Mrs. J. Henry Colburn and son Clarence and Mrs. Ida M. Gould are enjoying vacation days at Alton Bay, New Hampshire. The welcome showers that fell during Wednesday night were too late to redeem the berry crop, which has suffered seriously in quality and quantity, except probably in most favorable locations to withstand the drought. The ladies of the Congregational Church met last week, Thursday, to make arrangements for their annual agricultural fair, to be held in September. Next Sunday, there will be the regular services at this church as usual, and Reverend Mr. Wallace will preach, and the 3 Sunday mornings following, the church will be closed for the pastor's vacation. The usual evening services will be held during this vacation and will be in charge of the deacons. The next section is called Wild West Show. In lieu of the pony auto races that have engaged the attention of a group of our small boys during the vacation for 2 or 3 past seasons, they substituted this year a very thrilling Wild West show. This took place last Thursday afternoon on the grounds back of the old Abbott homestead and was repeated again in the evening for the benefit of interested parents and friends. The large sum of 5 cents entitled one to all the sights. Possibly some of the stunts were in worthy emulation of some recently performed in an exhibition of the kind in a nearby city. But imitation is the sincerest flattery. That aphorism, imitation is the sincerest flattery, is attributed to the eccentric English cleric and writer Charles Caleb Colton, who died in 1832. And the boys put much energy and originality into their production. They portrayed Indians and cowboys, and some of the features were a parade, an attack on the plains of the caravan by the Indians, the burning of the stagecoach. There was also a burlesque of the Jeffries-Johnson fight and much singing. That's a reference to James Jackson Jeffries, the former undefeated heavyweight boxing champion who came out of retirement in 1910 to quote, reclaim the heavyweight championship for the white race, end quote, from the African-American reigning champion, Jack Johnson. They met in Reno, Nevada on July 4th, 1910, in, quote, the fight of the century, end quote. And Jeffries was knocked down twice in the 15th round for the first time in his life, and his managers threw in the towel. Johnson's victory triggered race riots across the country. The following boys took part: Edward Blodgett, Fletcher Abbott, Robert Abbott, George Perkins, Alfred and Bertram Sutherland, Charles Miller, Clifford Woods, and Morton Seavey. The next section is entitled Automobile Accident. An automobile accident happened Wednesday afternoon on one of the curves of Graniteville Road. The automobile, which was a large 40-horsepower Stoddard Dayton touring car, was owned by C. Marshall Forrest of Lowell. At the wheel at the time was Mrs. Forrest, who was driving, and 4 other ladies. The party were on the way to Neshoba Farm, but had not taken the right turn and were driving along towards Graniteville when the accident happened. This is a bad place at best for vehicles of any kind, with its winding curves and steep downgrade, and the road is not very wide. The emergency brake was applied, but the car skidded and collided with a big oak tree with a great force. This is a little bit different than the Graniteville Road that we know. At this time, the road had several sharp turns going down the hill from the center, and those were removed or at least modified in subsequent years that we'll read about in a Westford Wardsman newspaper down the road a bit. Mrs. G.E. Buckland of Lowell, mother of Mrs. Forrest, was thrown out and considerably injured, and the rest of the party escaped with a bad shaking up. From Arthur E. Day's residence, which was not very far distant, help was summoned from Lowell. Mr. Forrest hurried to the scene, bringing with him Dr. John H. Lambert. Mechanics were also summoned from the city and worked over the car for some time to get it in condition to get it back to its owner's home. The next section is entitled Taxpayers. The tax collector was busy last week issuing to the taxpayers of the town their bills as per the findings of the assessors. The total levy this year is $32,637.14, of which $22,399.44 is in real estate, $8,516.28 in personal property. The number of poll taxes is 701, making $1,402, and a moth tax of $319.12. The moth tax was to fight the gypsy moths and the brown-tailed moths that were prominent in Westford 100 years ago. The rate is $16 on 1,000. Those paying a tax of $50 or more are, and then there follows a list of 124 people and businesses who paid taxes of $50 or more, which I'm not going to read. The next section is the About Town section. Parkerville and suburbs will soon be connected by telephone with the hub, spokes, and rim of the rest of the town. As tree and moth warden, Nesmith lives near the capital of Parkerville. He lived at 233 Concord Road. It will be convenient to inform him when the moths are numerously assuming the office of tree warden. John A. Taylor recently gave an evening of readings at Hanover. John was one of the 2 sons of Samuel Taylor, who wrote the About Town section that we're reading now. William R. Taylor, who's the other son, left, quote, tending on the old campground, end quote, and tried Bear Hill Pond and environs in Harvard. Tending on the old campground was a popular Civil War song. It was written by Walter Kittredge, who died in 1905, and in 1863, and was first performed the same year at High Rock in Lynn, Massachusetts. Edwards and Monahan are making repairs on the Unitarian Church. The youthful Crosby brothers of Arlington are visiting their aunt, Mrs. Frank W. Bannister. The next section is entitled Death. The bright, clear life of Oak Hill has its clouds. This was most visible in the clouding of youthful life in the death last Saturday of Lewis L. Fletcher, the 11-year-old son of the Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher. Although ill for some time, yet not until 3 weeks ago was his condition pronounced hopeless by expert skill. Change of climate, scenes, and associates was all brought to bear in coaxing the life back to normal, but otherwise had made too strong a claim. Lewis had been one of the bright scholars of the Namnasset School, and a former teacher said, quote, "Teaching is made easy and simplified with such bright scholars," end quote. Besides his father and mother, he lives 2 brothers, Harold and Ralph, and 1 sister, Hazel. He was the youngest of the family. The funeral took place from the home of his parents last Sunday afternoon. Reverend J.M. Craig of Lowell conducted the service, and Mrs. F.L. Roberts, a favorite of the family, sang "Sometime We'll Understand" and "The Christian's Good Night." The bearers were Harold and Ralph Fletcher, Pearlie Knight, and Sidney Perham. Midst the flowers of the field and garden, the flower of youth was laid to rest in Fairview Cemetery. The next section is the Westford Grange section. The meeting of the Grange last week, Thursday evening, proved to be a degree of summer heat in it when the question of, quote, "What is the cause of the high cost of living," end quote, came up for discussion. After much perspiration, it was agreed that the increased output of gold was not the cause of poverty. Congress says it is. Let them say so as long as they don't believe it. The Grange Orchestra was lively and timely with its music under the direction of Arthur J. Blodgett. Edson Boynton sang much as usual, only more so. He had to come back and sing more. The next meeting on Thursday evening will discuss, quote, "To what extent should Massachusetts laws allow women to vote?" end quote, and also, quote, "How far should women be allowed to vote in town meeting?" end quote. This was in 1910, remember, before women's suffrage. Forge Village, a very pretty birthday party, took place last week, Saturday afternoon, when Miss Ethel M. Collins, youngest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Miles Collins, celebrated the 8th anniversary of her birth by giving a long party to a number of her little friends. From 2 till 5, the young folks made merry and played all sorts of pranks. At 5 o'clock, they were invited to the dining room, where a dainty tea was served. Prominent among the many good things was the birthday cake, with name and date of the young hostess. Many pretty presents were received. The little folks departed after having spent a very pleasant afternoon. Reverend Mr. Bumpus of Billerica, Illinois, conducted the services last Sunday at St. Andrew's Mission and preached a very interesting sermon. Next Sunday, Reverend Harry E. Irie, it's spelled I-R-I-E, of New York City, will occupy the pulpit. It is possible that one of these clergymen may receive a call to St. Andrew's Parish to fill the vacancy caused by the resignation of Reverend Thomas L. Fisher, which took effect early in June. The many friends of Miss Alice L. Prescott will be sorry to learn that she is at the Lowell General Hospital, where she expects to undergo an operation for appendicitis. The members of the John Edwards Hose Company held their regular practice on Tuesday evening. All the hydrants in the village were flushed out and found to be in first-class condition. Miss Eva Young of London, England, formerly of Westford, sent a check to be used for the benefit of St. Andrew's Mission to Reverend Thomas L. Fisher. The money was forwarded to a member of the Guild and will be turned into the treasury of the mission. Mrs. Hugh Daly of Leominster visited friends here on Monday. Mrs. Daly expects to move into one of the new cottages recently built on Lakeside Avenue next week. John Caddell, C-A-D-D-E-L-L, of Lowell was a Sunday guest of Mr. and Mrs. Miles Collins. Mrs. John E. Burnett, while attending the ball game between the Forge Village Lions and the Graniteville Blues at Graniteville on Saturday afternoon, was struck with the ball in the face, causing a very painful swelling and discoloration. Reverend Louis F. Havermel of the Methodist Episcopal Church of Graniteville and the boys' Sunday school class are enjoying life this week at the Chandler Cottage at Forge Pond. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Dodge and daughter Viola of Lowell are entertaining a party of friends at their cottage on the shore of Forge Pond. The next section is called A Great Success. John W. Bowker, a well-known millman of Lowell and for many years active in Good Templar work in this village, was in town on Wednesday. Mr. Bowker, who began work in the mills of Lancashire, England at the age of 10, is a warm advocate of keeping our children out of mills as long as possible and has written a play giving his experiences from the ages of 10 to 30. The piece was given at the Hathaway Theater at Lowell last May under the name of Just Plain Folks. Since that presentation, a prologue has been added showing William Stocks, the character assumed by Mr. Bowker, at the age of 12 seeking work at a mill. Master Elmer DeRone of this village has been secured to take that role, and to the author's mind represents the type of boyhood he wishes to depict. A large number from here attended the play when it was given last May and voted it a great success. The piece will be given in the early part of August under the title of The Doctor's Mistake. That's the news in Westford for the week ending July 30th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at westfordmuseum.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.